is, how does divorce impact the minister, the rabbi, the imam? And so what are some of the issues that are happening?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for this webinar. One of the challenges as a clergy person and as a caregiver, psychotherapist, marriage and family therapist is you don't want to do anything wrong. You don't want to cause more harm than good. And oftentimes, be it you're seminary trained or whatever the training may be, you don't know enough to realize you're in deep trouble. And so we end up making mistakes. I've come behind, unfortunately, so many clergy of various faiths who thought they were doing the right thing, only to realize they were not. One, that they didn't know the law. And then secondly, they didn't understand the, as you said, quagmire and the spaghetti, if you will, that's involved in divorce.
So today we're going to take a look at what is the divorce process in New Jersey. We're going to speak about something unusual, which is reconciliation. This is unusual because you may think by the time it gets to a divorce attorney or gets to a minister, it may be too late, but it really is never too late. Go through the simple do's and don'ts, look at some common scenarios, how to resolve these disputes, conclusion, have time for questions. Bob, if you could give a overview on just kind of bullet points that you would wish every clergy person would know about New Jersey divorce law.
Well, the divorce process itself is probably what you need to start with. First, you would need to make a decision to actually get divorced. And that could be a lengthy process, and that's often where clergy and other therapists, other people get involved with that. Once a decision to divorce is made, then one of the parties will file a complaint with the court. Court fees have to be paid. The other side will be given a certain amount of time to respond, and then the process begins. I always try to have negotiations first between the parties before you really involve the courts. But once the courts get involved, then their timetable prevails. There'll be information that has to be exchanged called discovery process. It could involve experts, financial experts, custody experts, employability experts, real estate appraisal experts. At some point, once all the discovery is provided, then mediation can begin, what's called alternative dispute resolution, which we'll be discussing later. Finally, and it only happens, thankfully, in 2 to 3% of cases, there'll be a trial if there's no resolution between the parties.
Can I ask, there's certain terms that we often hear thrown around, especially those of us who watch shows on TV, we may hear them. What is actual marital property? What does that mean?
Well, marital property generally refers to any asset or, frankly, debt that is built up during the marriage. So whether it's through the earnings of one person, if it's gambling winnings, whether it's spending sprees by one party, but it's anything that during the course of the marriage, either of the spouses have brought into the marriage other than traditionally inheritances and gifts from family.
So marital property in New Jersey is things that have originated in the marriage. Property, if a house was bought, if a new job was done, these are things that, as opposed to you're not bringing things that happened before the marriage, are not considered marital property in New Jersey?
Well, we don't have time to go through all the nuances, but there are numerous exceptions. For instance, if you purchased a house before the marriage, title solely only to one person, and then significant improvements were made to the house during the marriage. So the improvements become part of the marriage. Likely the increase in value of the house becomes marital property. There's quite a bit of exceptions, quite a bit of law that covers that area. It's a very broad area.
So let's take a little bit of time. I'm going to throw this unusual question to you, Bob. A divorce attorney can actually save a marriage. We've talked about this in some ways. We talk about reconciliation. This is something that you really take pride in. That how do you view the divorce process as an attorney?
I take a view that is somewhat different from many divorce attorneys. This is part of a very difficult legal process. It's very financially draining and very emotionally draining on not only the people getting divorced, but on everyone in their lives. It includes their employers, their children, their relatives, their parents. It includes everybody. So when somebody comes into my office and says, I want a divorce, first thing I ask is, are you really sure this is where you need to go? Have you explored the alternatives? Are you just angry today? Are you reacting to one or two things that happen? I want the people to recognize what they're going to go through in the process and the drain on them and everyone in their family. So, for instance, I'll recommend, have you spoken to your clergy? Have you sat down with your therapist? Is this where you really want to go? Once that is done, then often people will go out and seek to take the next step. No, we haven't sat down. No, we haven't been to a marriage counselor. Or they'll tell me we were there 5 times and it completely failed, and we'll go to the next step. The reconciliation is also a legal term. It's not just a semantic of getting back together, though. So reconciliation can also be that you filed the complaint for divorce. You've physically separated, but then you're making the attempt to get back together. And that's when I can construct for you, here are the conditions, here's the agreement. If we stay together, this is what our life is going to look like. And if we then divorce at some point, let's make it an easier divorce. And we've pre-agreed on quite a few of the issues, like, for instance, who's keeping the business, who's keeping the house. There's many things you can agree on in advance. It's almost like having a prenuptial agreement within the construct of a reconciliation agreement. They're tough to put together because it's hard to negotiate. We're going to live together with, we're going to separate and be divorced at the same time. But I've had a number of couples who do it. It's about a 50% success rate at the end of the day.
Just, Will, do you have comments? Are you surprised to hear that from a divorce attorney?
No, actually not. I remember I probably have a PhD in divorce. I was divorced twice. So the first one didn't go well. It was horrible. I still, some 20, 30 years later, remember it painfully. The second one was probably a model divorce. We sat down at the table as 2 intelligent people who, over 20-something plus years, realized we were going in different directions in our lives. I said, what do we do about it? We went to therapy. We had a couples therapist who worked with us. At the end of that process, probably was about a year actually, that we said, you know what? We love each other, but we just grown apart. Between graduate school and everything else that happened, this person married a fast track business person who became a clergy person. Wasn't what the person signed on to do. And so we agreed that how do we make this work for both of us? And so at that particular time, we agreed on a company line. This is what we're going to tell the public. Now, what you tell your family behind closed doors is another conversation, but publicly, this is the company line that we both agree upon that we will share, and that we will say to people that divorce is emotionally draining. It's tough. It's difficult. It's not something that we've taken lightly, and we would appreciate if you don't ask us, what happened and how did this happen, who did what and all those kinds of things. And at the same time, as you were saying, Bob, if you were my friend before this happened, you can still be my friend. For only one caveat, don't ask me how the other person's doing, or don't do this UFO sighting. Guess who I saw and guess what they're doing now? Because that doesn't help us. And we need your support, we need your ongoing love. And we had a handshake agreement among ourselves. Let's not do a little dividing line and say, these are my friends, these are your friends, and have people pick a side. That is not helpful. And so I'd like to say that fast forward some 18 years later, that we can say that we are friends because we tried to look at the best way to make this possible that involve reconciliation. Something that I use with couples that I see either as a pastor or as a marriage and family therapist is, this was a person at some point you loved enough to marry. So let's sit down and draw up what are you going to miss? And not be sarcastic, not those stones. What are things that really you truly are going to miss about this relationship? And what are some things you're not going to miss? And to look at those, both of those, and to celebrate. These are the things I'm going to miss about you. These are the things I'm going to miss about the relationship. These 3 or 4 things, I'm so glad I'm not going to deal with this any longer. And look at both of them. And so are there going to be ways that you acknowledge a year from now what happened in a positive way? In our world as clergy, as therapists, anniversaries are important. So how will you acknowledge the anniversary a year from now that the 2 of you divorced? How will you acknowledge 3 years from now? And if there are children involved, how are we going to be able to negotiate so that you don't parentify your child? Meaning, you don't say to the children, oh my God, your mother or your dad, oh my God, how horrible they are. That's not part of being a parent. You should keep that conversation to yourself or to your closest friends, but not to your children. So we make that part of the conversation, make that part of the process. How are we going to deal with the in-laws, the outlaws, the family, and to say, okay, I get it, you love me, I get it, you want the best for me, but at some point, please butt out.
Okay. So let's talk about and I'm going to show this to Bob, what would you want, and I have a couple do's I suggested, but what were some things that a clergy person, a congregant comes up, I'm getting a divorce. What are some things that you would love to see the clergy, the rabbi, imam, priest, minister do that would make your life easier and maybe even make the situation better based on your experience?
Well, the first thing is that the clergy needs to be very aware of what their role is. Number one, they have to encourage honest communication with their congregant. Generally, somebody will go to the clergyman and give their perspective. Could be a very skewed perspective, could be a very narrow perspective. It could be a perspective stemming from 1 or 2 narrow issues. And that doesn't help the clergyman aid both parties and either put the family back together or to help them move to the next step in their lives. So just as in a marriage, communication is important. In the divorce, the communication is important. And the clergyman needs to elicit that honest communication and try to read between the lines. The clergyman also has to be honest with herself. What are the realities? What do you know about these people? What do you know is not true about what the person's telling you? Are they being honest with you? Are they being forthright with you? Are you too close with them that you cannot objectively sit back and think about what's in this family's best interest? Because you're not only talking about the one person who approaches you, but you're worried about the entire family, especially always the children first. Most judges will tell you, children first. They're not the ones who created this mess, so they're the ones who need to be protected. And that's, I believe, a clergy person needs to really protect the kids first. Clergyman has to be very, I don't want to say defensive, but vigilant in trying to watch out, is this person trying to align you in a certain direction? Are they really looking for help from you? Are they trying to set you up potentially? I've given seminars to pediatricians to warn them about a parent who will try to bring them into a litigation by getting what used to be called DIFUS, now called DCPP, involved maybe abuse claims against the other parent. Are they dropping hints that the other parent is abusing the children? You have to be very careful that a congregant might try to drag you into the litigation where you're almost a witness to what's going on. I understand there's privilege and the Reverend could address all those kinds of issues, but you have to be very careful about being dragged in. If you're told about an abusive situation at the home that involves a child, what are your obligations as a clergyman to notify state authorities about that? And also then to know your limitations. What are your skills? What were you trained at? Are you a financial analyst? If somebody comes to you and tells you, this is the support I need, this is the problem in the marriage, are you an expert in any particular category? Then you can help in a certain direction. But if you're not, that's when you need to know, here are my resources. Who can I call? Can I call Bob to ask him if there's a question about law in New Jersey? Do I have an accountant on hand if I need to help the people in this regard? So you have to also define what you want to do for the person and what you're able to do.
Do appreciate that there's stigma, that there's shame, and oftentimes there's silence associated with the decision to divorce. And so when a couple comes to you, appreciate that this goes far beyond just two people in the room. And especially if they're members of your congregation, they're going to be and will be ripples that go throughout the congregation. And if you mishandle it, you can have a larger mess than just two people saying that we can't work together, we can't be together. So be aware of that. Everything that Bob said is absolutely true through the clergy perspective. People will try to get you to take a side. And sometimes you do it. Sometimes it touches an issue that's close to you. You have to look at yourself and say, okay, this is not about me. This is about this particular couple. And yes, I do have an opinion. However, I need to remain as neutral as possible, short of there being any kind of violence. If there's violence, all bets are off. That's a different conversation. But short of just two people bickering, yelling, whatever, not to take a side. And people will try to provide something that alarms you or shocks you. Or in our case, they'll thump on your sacred literature and say the Bible says this or whatever the sacred literature says. And so tell him or her, we can't get a divorce because it's against the Bible. You know, it's against the Torah, it's against this and that. And so not getting pulled into the middle of that and recognizing that there are people that don't belong together. And they've done everything they can to try to reconcile. But at the end of the day, you're correct. You should go separate ways. Let's try to do this in a way that's peaceful, that's respectful, that honors the love that you had for each other at one point, and honors the God or the fill in the blank that you say that you look up to, that you respect, that you worship.
The one thing I want to add that all clergy should know, if you have to know one thing about the divorce process in New Jersey is a no-fault state. It became that, I think about 16, 17 years ago, which means all you need is one party saying, we have irreconcilable differences. You don't need two people opining as to that. You don't need fault anymore. You don't have to show adultery. You don't have to show acts of extreme cruelty. All you have to say is for 6 months, we've had irreconcilable differences, and that's caused the breakdown of the marriage, and that's it. For a lot of people, especially for clergy people going through a divorce, very tough to understand that, grasp it, and to accept it as this is my reality. I don't want it to happen, but I can't prevent it. When they understand that, you can get through the process a lot better.
And when we filed for divorce, I did no fault for that reason, because I didn't want somebody to look it up one day and go, oh my God, this is what happened. No, it was no fault.
Okay. So let's go through a couple quick scenarios, and I'll take one. We kind of talked about what happens when congregants ask for help, but how do you deal with a situation? I'll begin with you, Will. Is that if one party says this marriage is irreconcilably over, and then the other party says no, I really want this to happen? How would you, as a pastor, respond to that situation?
Well, firstly, I make sure they're both in the room at the same time. And I'm going to suggest to them they go for counseling. And that one of the things that I think is important as a clergy person, as Bob said, is to refer, to recognize what your gifts and skills are, what is it that your training allows you to know and to not know. And if this is something that is not your area of expertise, then you refer, which means you should always have a network of different caregivers, different professionals. And you should know ahead of time, these are the best people to deal with people in the midst of divorce, and make a referral. At the same time, to understand, lay out, so you're members of the congregation. You may be one of the officers or leaders of the congregation. So let's agree how we're going to go forward. so we don't divide the congregation over your being divided and trying to file for divorce. I think that's, to me, that's very important. I've obviously been a pastor for 36 years, and I've had more than my share of people saying I'm going to file for divorce and so forth. And I found that in every instance, when the couple trusted me to say, these are the ground rules, so to speak, as it relates to the congregation. These are the ground rules as it relates to how you're going to relate to each other. These are the professionals that can help you to guide you through this process. It went smoothly. When folks said, no, I'm going to do it on my own, it didn't go well.
As an attorney, Bob, as an attorney, how do you deal with that situation where somebody says, yes, I want a divorce, but the husband or wife says, no, I really don't?
Well, the first thing is, as I mentioned before, you explained that in New Jersey, you're going to get divorced if all you need is one of you who wants it. The second thing is, I would tell the person who's the one who wants the divorce at the time, you're on your own timetable, and you've made that decision, which didn't just happen yesterday. It took you time to arrive at that decision. You should give the courtesy to your partner that it might take them little time. Maybe they're ready right now. It might take them a longer time. And you cannot demand too much too soon. You have to expect them to go through the process that you went through. When you understand that, then it's easier to work together, because both of you need to be at the same place at the same time to be able to arrive at a settlement. Otherwise, one of you is always counter-punching the other. And especially in custodial situations, so both of you accept where you are, you're not going to get anywhere.
Okay, this is the big question. This is going to be Bob's area, is how much is this going to cost? I do want to mention on the Kornitzer website, there is a video about the cost of divorce, which when people register, you will be given a link to that video. But we're going to want to look, one thing that I've been hearing a lot is nastiness actually makes it more expensive. The more agreement is a lower cost, and that does not have to go to trial, that there are alternative ways of getting a dispute. So if you can comment on some of how agreement can lower costs, you've touched on this, and then what are some of the alternative disputes resolutions and why they're less costly?
Okay, well, what I always try to do is right from the get-go to have settlement conferences where you're sitting down with the attorneys and with the parties, and where we're trying to resolve issues at a time. You don't have to resolve everything at one time. Even if you sit down to agree, this is the type of information we need to exchange. We have a business, we have to value the business. We have a house, we agree to sell the house. The more things that you can take off the table, the easier it is to agree on that diminishing balance of items. You always try to discuss issues like custody first. What is it going to look like? What are your households going to look like? What do you anticipate your arrangements? Do you work in New York City? Do you work here? What are your hours? Are they flexible hours? So the more you talk during the litigation, the better chance you have of pulling issue after issue off the table, stop it from getting into court, and really stop the process that gets very expensive. Letter writing between attorneys, accountants involved, all kinds of people involved. So the more, even small agreements, you'd be surprised that even a small agreement, how they accumulate at the end. The mediation process is where you have a neutral third party who comes and just sits in a room and tries to broker a deal. So to me, that's always the most effective after all the information has been exchanged. Quite frankly, when you have two experienced matrimonial attorneys in a room, we can tell you within percentage points financially and very close on custody where this is going to end up just based on our experience. So you don't always really need mediation. Mediation initially means that you had a breakdown in communication between the parties and between counsel, and you needed to go to a third party. Drawback with a mediator is their job is to make a deal. It's not to make the right deal. So theoretically, a mediator can have the parties agree to something that is really skewed in the favor of one as opposed to the other. Usually the louder, the more domineering party will do better with a mediator, because the mediator won't be able to get a deal unless they have that party behind them. So there are drawbacks. There's good parts to it. There are drawbacks. Arbitration is something where you're having a person who's like a surrogate judge, sits at the table with you, and in your own office, you're avoiding the court system, but you have to pay for the arbitrator. The arbitrator will make all the decisions that a judge can make. There's a cost to it because you're paying the arbitrator. It's usually a very experienced attorney or retired judge. But you also save in time because you sit down on your own terms and you can get full days from an arbitrator, where in a court you can get 1 or 2 hours at a pop. But there is a cost to it. It's very useful if there's anything you don't want to be known in public. So for instance, if you have a cash business in your store that you own, if there's anything illegal that's ever gone on in your life that you don't want to come to the attention to a judge who has to notify the Treasury Department or has to notify the prosecutors about it, the arbitrator's the way to go and keep it out of the system.
And there's an additional cost that may or may not be financial. That is, in some faith traditions, they don't believe in clergy that are divorced. And so if it's a clergy person that's filing for divorce, that could be a career decision. And they have to be mindful of that they make the decision to file for divorce, that their church leadership may say, thanks, but find another job.
But also, even within the religious community, divorce may lower your standard. You may lose a deep position of being a deacon, of being a shamus, and in this area. So what we'll do is, to conclude, let's ask, what are 3 or 4 takeaways? Well, we want to start. What are 3 or 4 things that clergy person should know?
Refer, refer, refer. Don't take a side. I didn't learn this I did not learn this in seminary. I learned this during my 4 years as a resident in psychoanalytic training. Digest all of it as simply information. Don't place a value judgment on it. It's just information. Because as Bob said, they will usually begin with something to shock you, to push you to take a side. And to resist that, they go, okay, it's information. I know as a pastor and as a therapist, whenever I ask one person, I ask the other person. And I want to get both perspectives and not just lean to, ooh, I like you, or you touch my buttons and I hear what you're saying, and ignore the other person. I think that is important. And again, to recognize that this is a landmine. You can step on something innocently, and next thing you know, you have a mess with the couple as well as your congregation, and it goes within the community.
What are some things you?
Well, the first thing is that clergy really has a higher calling, in my opinion. You're not just a therapist. You're not a friend. You're somebody in a lot of pain is coming to and bearing their soul. When I counsel people, I want you to go to your clergyman and talk first. That has to be a very difficult moment, because you're admitting a failure in your life to somebody that you respect. That's why you're going to them. You know, the congregants want guidance, and they need a very even-handed, cool-minded guidance. It's not just personal therapy. Like the Reverend said, don't be timid to seek out guidance on issues that you have questions about. It's much better than giving poor advice to someone and putting them in the wrong direction. And one final thing is the religious divorce against civil divorce in many religions. This is an issue I've written quite a bit about, and that comes up very frequently. And it's tough to navigate, because often there are differences that cannot be reconciled, but there are often differences that can be reconciled and that work together. So everybody needs to be in the process together and understand what's at stake for each of your congregants.
And because we mentioned the pastoral perspective, pray. Pray together, pray separately, pray with the religious leader that's in the room with you, but to lean on the power of prayer to get you through this, to give you some answers, to help you reconcile, to help you to what are the next steps forward, but to pray.